Welcome to Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. Earlier during his autobiographical journey, Sir Henry declared his love for art. Today it remains one of his passions.
So in retirement, I did a whole lot of things that would make a difference. And I planned painting holidays, which I'd had in the past, admittedly. I painted from childhood, you see. From the age of maybe 4, as long as I can remember myself, we had childhood crayons.
We were 4 siblings, and my mother, who wasn't very well-to-do, was a very creative person, mostly in the field of cooking, but she was a bit of a craftsperson. And she appreciated the value of art. And I had an aunt on my mother's side and an aunt on my father's side who were regarded as painters. And the house was filled with watercolors, most of which have deteriorated and long been lost because, as Denise would say, they weren't properly conserved. And so from the age of 4, my older sisters and I were involved in what my mother could have been accused of organizing child labor. Every November or so, we were put to sit in a row and paint hand-painted Christmas cards. And so the painting began from that era, and I was rapidly known as the one who could actually draw.
And then an aunt who was an artist taught me how to draw a coconut tree, which most people had difficulty with. Well, I never looked back from there. I drew coconut trees, I drew people, I drew cartoons, I drew houses.
I find drawing very facile, but at school, at Lodge School, painting was regarded as totally non-kosher, absolutely non-kosher, non-cool, and painting was for the girls' schools. Harrison College was lucky to have Briggs Clark, and Combermere had Carl Brute-Hagen, but Lodge School, the guys stopped painting from the age of 10. You just were not expected to paint. And so I painted on my own, and it was really photographic, watercolor, and drawing, and so on.
And in my school days, I subscribed, my mother subscribed for us to magazines which came out of Britain. And I painted and submitted paintings and drawings for competitions. And I won a whole series of prizes, which were usually book prizes. So part of my childhood collection of books was the prizes I won for my paintings. When I went to university, I thought, well, my goodness, I'm going to be working extremely hard. I'll never have time to paint again. But I got engaged in painting.
I took a couple of my rather realistic paintings of seascapes, the crane and Consett and so on, up to university with me, and there was a craft workshop at university, and some of the guys who were involved in this came into my room in hall, and they said, wow, and you know, you got to start painting again. So I had to go down to Hills Galleries in Kingston and buy my paints and my inks, and I started painting again in university. And I was inspired by the fantastic creative people of Jamaica. I mean, Jamaica is now known for lots of things, and we won't go into some of the things that have attracted the attention of the press in the last couple of years, but it is a very creative place. And with the inspiration of Edna Manley and all the great contemporaries of hers in the 50s and 60s, when I went to Jamaica, I was just bowled over.
I was inspired by the art all around the Jamaican campus. Jamaica is an artistic country. Jamaica had a premier's wife, Mrs. Edna Manley, who was a magnificent, amazing woman, really an artistic genius and a leader of people. And she inspired Jamaicans who had an indigenous creativity. The Jamaicans really expressed themselves well in every way.
I didn't think there was much creativity in Barbados. I had seen an exhibition by the great Hector Whistler, and he was one of my early inspirations because his watercolors of places like Martin's Bay, where he lived, absolutely liberated my ideas about how to use watercolor. And in Jamaica, a very similar thing happened, and I was greatly influenced by Barry Watson, who was the doyen of the second half of the 20th century in Jamaica. He sort of replaced Edna Manley as the great leader principal of the art school, a fantastic painter. And I was very lucky because I was introduced to him by Lucille Mayer, the warden of the female hall in Jamaica, Mary Sukol Hall. And Barry came up to our workshop on Sunday mornings, and we had personal coaching from this great artist for 3 months every Sunday morning. So he tremendously influenced my watercolor.
I was inspired by the art on campus, and I started painting on campus. And I realized, in fact, in my clinical years, that I could paint and sell my paintings. Now, the Barbados Scholarship Funds were exceedingly limited, because this is the late 1960s that I'm a student in Jamaica, and the funding for universities students who had won a Barbados scholarship had been planned and assessed and delivered at the same level since 1950. It was all planned in 1950, I was told by the officials. And so here was I in 1966, 67, 68, 69, living on a 1950 allowance, and it simply wasn't practical. So I painted and I sold my paintings, and that was tremendous fun. I painted across the Blue Mountains. I loved painting nature, and I painted mountain scenes and river scenes and so on. So that was a tremendous period of my life. And then I went off to Britain in the middle 60s. I was in Britain, and I went to Europe on a hitchhiking tour with a friend, and I took my paints. So I painted in France, and I painted in Greece, and we had a tremendous time. I was painting nature, but I was also fascinated by the ruins all over Greece. And there was a particular little island called Delos, where visitors could only go between 9 and 5. And my friend and I hid among the ruins so that I could paint the sunset and the sunrise against the ruins. That was all great fun. I gave most of those paintings away. And then my wife and I, in later days, we spent 4 years in Britain. I was doing my postgraduate specialty training, and my wife was doing her dermatology. She became the best trained dermatologist in the Caribbean. She had 4 years of dermatology in Britain, doing research, seeing patients, writing papers, and so on. And I did my PhD. Now, with all of that work, we had to have downtime. And so we actually went to evening classes where she made jewelry and I painted. And I painted with a couple of magnificent tutors. And then on Sundays, I'd go out and paint nature. I'd paint in the parks and so on. And it all came to a head when I had an exhibition, which I've talked about in a previous show, a previous interview. I talked about the exhibition I had in London. So that was really quite a tremendous time for my life, painting almost professionally and having a professional show. So when I came back to Barbados, I said, now how am I going to paint? And I went off on a painting holiday at Bathsheba. And there's a painting or two that I did at Bathsheba that really, I think, personally, with all humility, are really fabulous because I love seascapes. And what I try to do in my painting is to translate the sun and the energy of the waves and so on, so that people get a feeling, not just a flat painting, but a very energetic painting. That's what I'm always trying to do.
And my watercolor was not quite as free as Goldie's hair, which I love her pen and wash technique. I got that when I was in London as a postgraduate student. I knew a couple of artists there who introduced me to a pen and wash technique. And so that kind of process, I stuck with watercolor because watercolors were cheap, and as a student, as a poor Bayesian growing up, I couldn't afford oils. And as a student, I couldn't afford the time. And so I kept using watercolor when I came back as a student in my 20s, then painting in London and back in Jamaica, inspired by the wonderful color of Jamaica, because watercolor was cheap and it was quick. And so I learned a technique which involved painting very, very quickly. So the process, I like to paint quickly. I sketch quickly and I paint quickly. And for me, I will do outdoor sketches, occasionally outdoor watercolor sketches, but mostly outdoor pen sketches. And then I'll paint with my wet paper on a board, and I paint wet and dry when the paper then dries, so I get a lovely combination of techniques and textures and feelings, because the paint will flow sometimes, and then other times you do all sorts of crazy things, and sometimes you spatter. I don't know if there's any spattering in these paintings, but I love spattering watercolor onto my paintings, especially when you're painting a seascape and the spray and things like that. And so the other thing about painting in watercolor for Linda, you're the watercolorist of the flowers, right? The other thing about watercolor painting is that everybody thinks it's terribly difficult. And of course, there's a challenge to using watercolor, but the idea of watercolor is terribly difficult because you can't correct things. Well, A, yes, you can if you want to and you know how to, but B, you don't have to correct it. I mean, if you're doing a painting that takes you 20 or 30 minutes, and it goes wrong, and you feel you can't correct it because correcting sometimes makes edges look hard, and you don't want that. That spoils the fluidity. Then you just throw the piece of paper away. The paints haven't cost you much. The paper is the most expensive thing. Willie Allen, my great photographer friend, always said, the film is the cheapest thing. The costly thing is your time. So take as many pictures as you can. The film is cheap, your time's expensive. With digital cameras, of course, pretty well little cost, so you can take as many as you like. But the same thing with watercolor. If a watercolor doesn't work, then you discard it. And sometimes I discard. Sometimes I put things away thinking I will discard them, and somebody comes along and says, wow, I like that. You know, and so since my wife is my greatest fan, she often likes things that I want to tear up, you know. But inspiration-wise, my inspirations really has been the landscape. I see the world visually. For me, there's a picture everywhere. You know, there's a great picture in this room. There are pictures on people's faces. There are pictures between things. Every tree and shrub and building for me is literally a potential picture.
And I then started going to the Crane as well. So I was painting at the Crane. And I've had mixed shows and exhibited things in galleries in Barbados. I had a wonderful show of watercolors with Norma Talma, a professional watercolorist at Talma Mill. And I've had shows, paintings exhibited in other places in Barbados as well. In the Sheraton Mall, there was once a gallery called the Bridgetown Gallery run by Martha Berry. And that was a great occasion because she invited me to have a special central display. And one of those paintings was a painting of the Crane Beach. It was right in the center, and I had a series of basically beach scenes and seascapes all arranged together as a centerpiece. And she used my key painting as the exhibition invitation card. So that again was a very satisfying occasion. And I've continued to paint at Bathsheba and at the Crane on what I call painting holidays. And this is really a tremendous opportunity for me to indulge in nature. And, you know, as someone once said, you lose yourself in art and you find yourself in art. It's really a wonderful way of enjoying nature and producing something that you enjoy and that people enjoy. One of the things I've tried to do in art is to promote art as a national pastime, as a national a kind of national pride, national industry. For example, there was an organization called Foromix, which is a cultural and economic organization of Latin American and Caribbean countries. And the Foromix conference came to Barbados about 10 years ago. And I was invited to give a keynote lecture on culture in Barbados and the economic opportunity. And I made the point that we have in Barbados several hundred artists who are not promoted. It is not part of our cultural and tourism promotion. And I do not understand why. We promote food, restaurants, beaches, song and dance, Crop Over Festival, and other things that relate to movement and to eating. Food and dance and song. Food, dance, song, and sea and sand. These are the things we promote. But we have a magnificently rich culture in art. This has simply exploded. And I've written in my columns and talked about the explosion of art in Barbados. We don't promote it. There should be more people able to make a living from art. Everyone who comes to Barbados and who is important should be given a gift of art. And we are not utilizing that. We are not selling the objects that represent our art. If you go to America, you might pick up a Statue of Liberty. If you go to Paris, you might pick up a copy of the Eiffel Tower. If you go to Italy, you'll come back, no doubt, as I have done, with a little statue of Michelangelo's David. We don't do that. We have, for example, in Barbados, the most important cultural artifact, perhaps, in the entire Caribbean, and that is the South Point Lighthouse. The South Point Lighthouse is the biggest of 4 prefabricated iron-plated lighthouses, brought here in 1852 January, after being exhibited and making a fantastic mark in London in the Great Exhibition of 1851. And that South Point Lighthouse, I have written about it, I have organized government trips to it, and people talk about it but do nothing. It is a glorious building. It is an artifact we should be proud of. It's not our creation, but it is part of our architectural heritage and culture. And it should be the #1 tourist attraction in Barbados. It is, in fact, an informal attraction. So what I have tried to do over the years is to promote the development of the economy of art. I have tried to persuade business people to do what the Jamaican business people do, to promote and sponsor art. In Jamaica, the life insurance companies all compete to have the best collection of art. So they commission works of art. That doesn't happen in Barbados. If you go into a bank in Barbados, you see a big photograph of two smiling people trying to persuade you to borrow more money. You know, there is no sensitivity. It is a cultural lack that is quite extraordinary. I don't understand it, and I'm saying now, for anyone who watches this, please, people with money, businesses, please patronize our poor, striving artists. Now, some of my drawings and paintings relate to architecture because, as I said in an earlier program, I once, in my youth, wanted to be an architect. And there's a famous story that I was told I couldn't be an architect. It didn't make sense because Barbados already had one. And we didn't need another architect, which is really quite funny because that was the vision in the old days. People felt that every man should be able to build his own house, you see. So we didn't need architects. But I've had this passion for architecture. And my first serious non-medical book was Historic Houses of Barbados. I had been inspired by a book I found in Ontario, in London, Ontario, and I started sketching, doing pen and wash drawings, paintings of houses around Barbados, and published a book called Historic Houses of Barbados. That was the first of my many books. And in that book, I originally, in first edition, had 31 paintings, and the second edition, 55 paintings, and the third edition showed photographs of those buildings 25 years later, taken by Mike Toy. And in some cases, the buildings had become dilapidated. In some cases, the buildings had actually been destroyed. But I've always loved doing houses, and one of my favorite paintings, which hangs in our dining room, is a painting of the old Trafalgar Hotel. Now, that was an important building because it was a 3-story hotel that had operated over 100 years, and it was where Sir Grantley Adams and the other parliamentarians used to eat lunch. In the good old days, there was no dining room in Parliament, as there is now. So the parliamentarians would take their break and cross Palmetto Square to the Trafalgar Hotel, and there they would have their lunch. And then there was a famous barber there, and people used to meet there and talk politics on a Saturday morning and have their haircuts. And that Trafalgar Hotel was demolished in 1978. And my friend Omar Wallace Stewart, the artist, called me and said, "Henry, they're going to demolish the Trafalgar Hotel tomorrow. We're going down there to paint it." So Omar Wale and Akiem and I and a couple of others went down, and we did our first painting or sketch of the Trafalgar Hotel. Now, knowing it was going to be demolished, people couldn't do anything major. There was a sketch that first afternoon. And what I did was to sketch it on day 1, before demolition, on day 2, and then day 3, when the demolition was almost completed. So this produced for me a triptych that I could then paint, and I exhibited that triptych in the Barbados Art Foundation exhibition the first year that they had that. That's one of my favorite paintings of a building. I still do buildings intermittently, but I confess that I like painting nature, seascapes and landscapes in my garden more than I actually do buildings. And what my wife and I have tried to do, my wife is also an artist, although not as committed and hasn't done as much as I do, but she has done a lot of work herself in terms of design and creativity. And so we would choose paintings together. We would go to the local exhibitions, and since we were slightly more, should I say, well-heeled than some of the artists, we would try to buy paintings from artists who were attempting to make a living through their painting. So we have bought many paintings, mostly small paintings of artists that we have known, come to know and respect and admire. And our collection, therefore, is a very broad collection of modest paintings of a wide range of Barbadian artists. I have my favorites, Omar Wallace Stewart and his brother Sundiata, Arthur Atkinson, Alison Chapman Andrews, all kinds of Claremont Tate is one of my favorites. And I also have a few Jamaican paintings that are very important to me, that I've acquired in Jamaica, that are very special. And of course I have my own paintings, some of which have been successful. I won the first prize and the third prize for drawing and painting in the Jamaican National Art Festival. And I was competing against the students at the Edna Manley School of Art. And I came away with those two amazing prizes, which was quite a feat against these semi-professional artists in training. So painting has been a tremendous fun. I've also liked collecting ceramics, and I had a very good friend called Bill Grace, who sadly died of a melanoma, and I have a very large collection of his pots, ceramics and so on that he made, as well as his sculpture. And he and I interacted in terms of the work that he did. So art for me has been a refining passion. I've enjoyed it immensely. I've always wanted to be able to do more. And in my retirement, I'm obviously doing more than I used to. So I do hope that one day I'll have another one-man show. One day. What is the kind of, if I like, overwhelming element of my life? And it really is writing. From the time I was very small, I was taught to write, and I just enjoyed writing. My mother was our primary school teacher for all four of us. She had been a primary school teacher when she was young for about 5 years before she became a postmistress and eventually became the first head of a government department in the civil service in the GPO, the General Post Office. But she taught us to write. She taught us our ABCs and our letters and, you know, how to read The Cat Sat on the Mat and things like that. And as soon as we could put words together at the age of about 5, we had to write thank you letters every Christmas. Literally, in the days after Christmas, all of us would sit around the dining table and we would write these thank you letters for Auntie Jean and Uncle Joe for the gifts that they'd given us at Christmas. So it began with thank you letters. And then my older sisters and then I and my brother, we were all encouraged to have what was called pen pals. And the children's magazines used to have addresses of kids around the world who wanted to write to other kids. These were pen pals. And so I developed a long list of pen pals that I wrote on a regular basis. I had pen pals in Britain, in the USA, in Canada. We didn't know many people in the Caribbean, but we went around the world. I had a pen pal in Gambia, and to my surprise, one day I received a wonderful package of peanuts, which my pen pal in Gambia said, these are our main exports, so I'm sending you some very special peanuts which are grown on my parents' land. I had a pen pal in Nairobi, one in New Zealand, and so on. And that letter writing was something important for us to communicate with people, and it gave us a knowledge of people and culture around the world. I wonder how many kids are encouraged to do that today. And then there was school, of course, and essay writing. And we had to write an essay every single weekend in English class. So when I think about it, I would have written at least 30 essays a year from Prep B until 5th form, which is 7 years of writing 30 essays. 7 threes, 210 essays, plus the essays you would write in exams at the end of the term. So I had written several hundred essays by the time I left school. And I always wanted to write. In university, of course, things changed. You started to write more objectively. In school, in science, you would write up a report on your science experiment. My research in university began with that. So my first few papers, 3 of my first 4 papers were papers written with Sir George Alleyne on the research I did in the research lab at the Tropical Medicine Research Unit with him. But that became a passion. And it's very satisfying when you write to see your writing in print. Nowadays, you just have to put it on the computer and print it out, and you can see your writing right there. But to see your writing in a professional journal, what we call a peer-reviewed professional journal, is very inspiring, and it's encouraging to people who do research, because I had the privilege of doing my PhD at the Royal Postgraduate Medical School, which some people have described as a paper factory, because it had a reputation for its research. And as my friend Professor Graham Sargent, the sickle cell guru of the world in Jamaica, working in Jamaica, as he said, if you do research and don't publish it, that can be considered unethical, because you're kind of wasting the involvement of the patients who took part, and you may lead to that work being done again and resources being wasted. So Graham Sargent always made the point, conceive the idea, do the research, publish your results. Sometimes the results are negative. They're not as exciting as you'd like them to be. And that is one of the issues that leads to unethical research, because some people may cook their results. But doing research and writing it up then became a major part of my life and a major part of my writing, so that in my medical area medical and scientific area of writing, I've written well over 100 scientific papers, co-authored with other people. You know, maybe a third of them were just mine, another third of them were mine and my mentees, as it were, and another third were the research of a group of several people working together. And we all have an input. Some do the actual research, some do most of the writing, and so on. So writing medical research has been a big thing. And then, of course, there are the articles that you write, there are the speeches that you give. All of this is more and more words, more and more words. And eventually, I moved on from that to writing in the non-medical area.
In the next program, we'll learn more of this authorship which has served to inspire us all. This has been Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for your time.